going to get started here, and I figured my presentation probably go about 35, 40 minutes, and then if we've got a couple questions today, that would be great too. But first and foremost, I want to thank you for your time today. I know that time seems more precious during the age of COVID than ever before, and so I appreciate it. And we of course are looking at the landscape for audio content today, primarily as it relates to thought leadership. So I'm Carol Flagg of Edison Media Network and HealthcareNOW Radio. I'm a managing partner in the company responsible for sales and marketing. I host a show on our network called What's My Tagline? I live in Phoenix. And on a personal note, I'm an avid baker, and some would say accomplished baker at that. So if we ever get together in person at a conference, I'll be sure to bring some stuff. Answers Media Network has been around since 2009 when we started our first site, High Tech Answers, after the passing of the High Tech Act as part of ARA. Today we operate Health IT Answers, a digital media outlet publishing articles and content on federal initiatives driving health IT technology adoption, as well as content focused on revenue cycle management, finance, healthcare innovation, telehealth, and more. Of course, much of our coverage recently in the past 6 months, and especially, has been COVID-19 driven. HealthcareNOW Radio is a B2B internet radio station and companion podcast channel launched in 2012 and is dedicated to providing content suited for healthcare providers, organizations, and the health IT community at large. The analogy we draw is that we are the NPR for health IT industry. Our live streaming station averages 36,000 listeners a month, and the companion podcast channel another 28,000 plays per month. All right, so here's our agenda today. We are living and working in unprecedented times right now, and not just because of COVID. Smartphones, smart speakers, plug-and-play cars, and other factors are dramatically changing our ability to attract, engage, and captivate an audience. Other digital channels like blogs, social media, video, virtual events, and the like simply are not enough, and there are very clear reasons as to why that is. So the goal today is to frame the conversation around recorded audio content as it relates to thought leadership and why, as marketers and PR folks, you need to be thinking about that. On the first half of the event, we're going to look at voice marketing, radio and podcast trends and research, and the impact of virtual assistants. And we'll finish up talking about content usages, analytics, and last but not least, of course, is our ROI. Hey Alexa, how do I work voice into my B2B marketing strategy? Well, let's talk about that. So we're going to kick off today looking at voice marketing. So voice marketing is loosely defined as using strategies and tactics to reach a target audience through voice-enabled digital devices, which include smartphones, smart speakers, cars, tablets, and other devices that we use for home and business. Voice marketing recognizes that we are moving away, and we're rapidly moving away from a tap, type, and swipe culture of physical interactions with our devices and keyboards to speech. And because of this shift, we need to approach voice in our content strategies the same way we did when we moved our content from a computer desktop environment to a smartphone environment, when we made those changes of the content that we were publishing. Also, when it comes to voice marketing, we face the practical issue of moving content conveyed in text and images to the spoken word and sound alone. So voice marketing presupposes that you, your company, your brand, your message, all have an audio identity that is harmonized as to strike a chord with your intended audience. And there are three primary components of voice marketing. There's sonic branding, which is how your brand sounds. There's recorded audio content like podcasts, radio shows, and interviews, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And there is what they call VSO, which is voice search optimization. And this is where brands optimize their content to be found in spoken searches. So we're going to look at these trends in voice marketing as it relates to, we're not talking B2C, as it relates to B2B content, and obviously B2B in our industry. And we want to look at what these trends are. First and foremost, of course, radio shows, podcasts, interviews, These are all the things. This is the world that we operate in HealthcareNOW Radio. Some of you on this webinar work with us directly and are very familiar with that format. Also, there is sponsored audio content, which is sponsored for a show or a podcast that aligns with your brand. You've all probably heard something like, today's episode is sponsored by, and that's what they talk about, sponsored audio content, where you're basically putting a brand messaging in front or at the end and sometimes in the middle of an audio content, whether it's a radio interview or a podcast. Commercials, of course, either in the style found on terrestrial radio, hey, Rock 25, or this is Rock 101, bringing you blah, 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 or what we favor, which is commercial spots with that NPR vibe. Sonic logos, which in a nutshell is your brand as a sound. Think about HBO, think about Netflix. They have an incredibly recognizable sonic logo. You hear that opening sound, and you know you're watching HBO or Netflix. The sonic logo conveys a meaning, mood, and personality of your brand. And last but not least, and certainly something that's pretty exciting, is an Amazon flash briefing. And these are rising in popularity and is a trend for everyone, including us, HealthcareNOW Radio, to keep an eye out in B2B marketing. So flash briefings are Amazon driven through an app development, free to anybody to put it together. But they're like mini podcasts, usually well under 10 minutes. And flash briefings can be used to reach customers, inform, talk about latest trends, certainly news, of course. And as the name suggests, the information should be very topical. These are flash briefings, so this is not intended to be evergreen content. But there are opportunities to incorporate them into marketing, though frequency is critical. Again, flash is the key word here. And if you get into or start exploring doing flash briefings, you want to make sure that you make a commitment to at least once a week. So news media organizations are using flash briefings right now, and they have for the last couple of years. But overall, it's pretty early stages for marketers, and especially B2B marketers. One note, though, that this is similar to how B2B marketers got interested in podcasts, right? It started with the media doing podcasts for their audiences, and then B2B marketers kind of jumped on the podcast bandwagon. So if you want to hear an example, you could say, Alexa, play New York Times flash briefing, and you'll hear the flash briefing from today's New York Times. All right, so let's talk about research, and we're going to really focus this research again on our sweet spot today, which is radio, podcasts, interviews, and that sort of environment, and especially as it relates to smart speaker and smartphone ownership and usage, because that is the voice marketing aspect that we're talking about. What we're going to be looking at is the Edison Research. This is going to be sort of the backdrop of what we're going to be talking about today. And so Infinite Dial Research has been it actually publishes every March and has been for many years. And so the intent of this, in the next few slides, is to paint a picture of the growth in audio content and thought leadership type initiatives, and what that, again, tying that to voice marketing. So, 10 years ago, 14% of the US market owned a smartphone. Today, it's 85%. So the smartphone has literally changed how we talk to each other, how we work, how we play, really everything in our lives, right? And I mean, do you guys, or does anyone remember what your life was like at home and at work before the smartphone? And it's hard to think about, but in reality, it's only really been a decade when you look at adoption rates of 14% in 2010 to 85%. 240 million Americans age 12 plus and over have a smartphone. So smartphone comes along, and of course they're ubiquitous, and now we have, of course, smart assistants, our Siris. So now we have smart speakers, and along came Alexa. So first there was this this mad consumption of smartphones. Everybody wanted a smartphone, and they rule our lives. in every form and fashion. And but now we're looking at smart speakers, and you can see, adoption was very low in 2017, and in just 3 years, an estimated 76 million Americans, 12 and over, have a smart speaker. And again, I use Alexa because they sort of dominate the market. And industry pundits suggest that the adoption rate of smart speaker ownership will be faster than smartphones. So it's not going to take 10 years to get to an 80+% adoption rate. It's more likely to happen in the next, two or three. So here you can see that collectively, with smartphones leading the way and smart speakers on the rise, that we are already at a 62% usage using voice-operated assistants to get information. And I'm sure all of you, have your Siris and your Alexas, or again, there are other products that are in play, but those are the two dominant. And as AI technology improves and learns faster to yield us, you, me, the consumers, better results, this number is likely to hit 80 to 90% in the next year or two. So when you think about how we're consuming content, and we talk about voice marketing, we are literally talking about these technologies that we're, moving away from tap, tap, swipe, swipe, and using our fingers. We're going to be saving our opposable thumbs, thankfully, and moving these sort of content areas to the realm of voice. So I'd like to narrow this discussion to thought leadership audio content, and specifically, of course, to podcast and radio. But first, I want to define what internet radio is and what podcasts are, because there is confusion out there with marketers and PR agencies. They've sort of taken hold of the term podcast, but they are different. There are different experiences even. So, but internet radio, simply put, is audio content that is streamed over the internet from a web page being http:// and any and all media devices with web browser access can be used to stream this content. By nature, it is streaming continuous content that can't be paused or replayed, which is a distinct difference from podcasts, which are episodic. And podcasts involve plays and downloads, how we talk about podcasts, rather than internet radio, which are streams and listeners. And some popular internet radio brands, household names: Pandora, Amazon Music, TuneIn, MPI, iHeartRadio, and of course, near and dear to our heart is our own HealthcareNOW Radio, which is the niche that we fit in the B2B space in health IT. So the following graph shows the growth and impact of internet streaming radio in this trajectory. And it's estimated, this is from the Edison Research that was published in March, it's estimated that 120 million Americans have listened to internet radio in the past month. That represents 68% of the market, 12+. So the growth curve you see is being driven, of course, by smartphone, smart speakers, plug and play cars, but particularly by smartphones, which you can see here. I did a side-by-side view showing the curvature of adoption of smartphones against a curve showing the growth of internet radio listeners. And I know I know it's pretty intuitive, especially when you start looking at 2009, where 10% adoption of smartphones, to today, and then look down at where we were with internet radio in 2009 and where we are today. And again, very intuitive. It's not surprising to anybody, but I just think it shows how closely connected the two are, the smartphone technology and now the smart speaker technology with online, internet, digital radio, whatever term you'd like to call it, but it is streaming continuous audio. A podcast is not internet radio. It's a episodic experience, and most consumers generally manage their podcast consumption through a particular service or app. So, and as an example, I'm a podcaster who hosts my show on SoundCloud. From there, it generates an RSS feed from SoundCloud that I then submit to Apple, Spotify, Google Play, and so on and so on. So using Apple Podcasts as an example, all those podcasts that you're seeing, if you use Apple Podcasts on your iPhone, they're all coming from various unique RSS feeds of podcasters. So, and using multiple channels to host their podcast show. So I've listed a few of the most popular podcast apps here for consumers, as well as the hosting side. So so the thing to remember about a podcast is very episodic. It is completely RSS feed driven. If I'm the podcaster, I find a podcast hosting service to publish my episodes on, and then I submit that RSS feed to places where people are finding their podcasts. So, and some of the more popular platforms for podcasters include to host their podcast or SoundCloud, Blueberry, Libsyn, Podbean, and others. And of course, those apps and services who give us podcasts, they're all household names, including Apple, Google Play, Spotify, and many others. So here you see the growth of curvature of podcast listenership. And I've noted, as you can see, in 2012, the year that Google Play launched an embedded podcast app on that year's version of the Android. Apple followed suit that same year and rebranded from iTunes as well to Apple Podcasts. So you can see the growth difference in the first 6 years from 2006 to 2012, right? We went from 11 million podcast listeners to 29 million. But then from 2013 to then 2020, we've jumped to 55 million. And this is pretty much a direct reflection of the move, first by the Android, Google Play, and then by Apple, which was really big. So it was a real game changer for podcasts and for marketers as well. What happened with the smartphone technology and the move by Google and iTunes. And again, like I did with internet radio, you can see this growth tied to the smartphone, and that is especially evident, as you can see, from the 2012-2013 window to 2020, and you see the curve as well from the podcast listening side. But here we are in just a great spot, right? As marketers who are looking at audio, and this infinite dial research came out in March 2012, and then we got COVID. So the past 6 months, I know, has felt like 6 years for all, and the disruption has been enormous. Of course, family, friends, loved ones, health, your health, my health, our health is all front center. But from an industry standpoint, the cancellation of in-person conferences since March has had a huge impact on all of us as marketers and agencies, and has created other issues listed here as well. And while virtual conferences and webinars, and lots of webinars, and lots of webinars quickly tried to fill this knowledge gap, this void that was left with the cancellation of these conferences, all of us have had to pivot. And there are some bright spots, though, in this new COVID world we face, and uncertainty as to when to in-person conferences especially will come back. So, but audio content in the form of radio shows, podcasts, and interviews and whatnot allows for thought leaders who are missing perhaps that in-person conference and or jumped on the virtual summit, virtual conference, virtual webinar environment, and perhaps didn't see the kind of audience they would like to have seen. The audio side of it allows them to share insights using the power of their voice. So these leaders can convey emotion, empathy, and educate an audience in a more personal and intimate way that can be accomplished by a webinar, an article, or even a virtual conference, some of the things that you're all doing today. The audio content in the form of a radio or podcast episode is a shared experience between the person talking and the listener. And if you listen to internet radio or you listen to podcasts, you know what I'm talking about here. And it's the power to tell a story. And there is information online showing the impact of the last 6 months on audio content consumption as people are working from home and continue to do so. And they want to stay informed, and they look into leadership for answers and guidance and insight and all those kind of things. So no surprise that it's on the rise as more people are working virtually. But I wanted to show the impact on us in the last 6 months, because we are an internet radio station and a podcast network. And I wanted to paint a picture of the impact that we have seen going where we were pre-COVID. And I'm talking about January and February of this year, and where we've been since March, since COVID, headed into September, it's September 1st. So this is March through August. And you can see that robust as it was, our average monthly radio listeners pre-COVID was about 21,000 a month, and today is at over 36,000 listeners a month. And on the podcast side, our average plays pre-COVID were about 20,000 a month, and today fluctuate between 27 to 28,000 plays a month. So we've seen this direct impact with COVID on our listeners and the people that follow all of our shows for podcast plays, as they are spending more time consuming this audio content. And I know we're talking specifically about thought leadership content, but you can see from this slide where ad revenues are headed. This projection was made prior to COVID in 2019, so it's unlikely that ad revenue for audio content and podcast advertising, it probably will not hit that number forecasted for 2020 and 2021. But certainly the trend is up, and will likely recover as the COVID recession economy recovers as well. All right, so I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about our favorite, my favorite virtual assistants, Alexa and Siri, and how recorded content can be found. And I am going to frame this around Siri and Alexa because, again, they do dominate the market share, but recognize there are other players in the market, and they virtual assistant players in the market, and they operate pretty much the same way. So let's talk about internet radio first. So internet radio content is really easy to find using Siri and Alexa voice commands, and that is because it's a web page. It's a stream-based web page. It is not an RSS feed. So when you make a command to either one of them on your smartphone or to your Echo, and you ask them to play a station, it'll pick up that stream, and it'll pick it up at the point that you're asking, because it is not episodic. It is a continuous stream. So if you listen to NPR and you listen to BBC America, or whatever you're listening to, it's going to pick it up at that particular point that you enter your command to either assistant. It has tremendous potential for reaching a large audience because of that ease of command, to ask it to find something, to ask it to play something, and because it is a web stream, it can pretty much start playing it immediately. So obviously, if the idea of doing a radio show is of interest, well, hopefully you're going to talk to us, of course, because we're HealthcareNOW Radio. But it's a platform, right? So we use Airtime as our platform to host our radio content. There are others, Radio Co, and there are many others as well that promote sort of the start your own radio show. And a lot of those players out there in the marketplace are saying, hey, if if you're doing, podcasts, you're thinking about podcasts, why not, push this into the radio space? And a lot of that really is because of the ease of finding it. When you do a voice command to these virtual assistants and the streaming side of internet radio. Podcasts, on the other hand, as I said previously, they are RSS feed based, and they're episodic by nature. Now they're very easy to use, obviously, in a smartphone. The iPhone has Apple Podcasts, the Android has Google Play, and the icon is right there. But it's a little trickier. It's really trickier with a smart speaker. So if you're using a smartphone, you can obviously search for podcasts on the built-in podcast icon, but you can ask Siri, to play a particular podcast show, and it should pick it up and start playing it for you because it has that podcast icons sort of built in, and that presumes, of course, that the podcast show is actually already in their library of podcasts, which, if you're a podcaster, it will be, trust me. But from a smart speaker standpoint, it's a little trickier. You have to, if you ask for a podcast show, Alexa's likely to come back and say, "Would you like me to enable the podcast skill?" which is a ubiquitous skill that the Amazon Echo employs to find podcasts. And then you say yes, and then you can go from there and ask to play this particular podcast show using the word podcast. One thing it does, of course, because we're talking about episodic, is it will pick up the latest episode. So if you're on a smart speaker and you find a podcast show you like and you wanted to listen to various episodes, you'd have to say previous, not next, because it will start with the very last podcast that was published to that particular feed. But you can kind of see why that might, podcasts is really feels like more of an environment for a smartphone, especially as you plug your smartphone into your car as you're driving along, which is how a lot of people listen to podcasts. It just is a little bit friendlier user environment. So let's talk real briefly about content usage. Obviously, with all content that we create, especially thought leadership content, we need to think about how we're going to reuse, repurpose, and take that content that took brain power and took bandwidth and took effort to produce, because really good content is not done quickly, right? Really good content, especially that is thought leadership driven, takes up brain power and bandwidth for all of us. We want to make the most of it, right? So I've just listed, and there's more than this. I've just listed a few to consider, which is obviously, number one is you can create audio content and video content together, meaning if you used webcams, use a Zoom or GoToWebinar or GoToMeeting or whatever webinar platform you choose, you can use webcams to record this conversation, this thought leadership conversation, and then, of course, just convert the MP4, which is the video side, to an MP3, which is the audio side. So you can double up, and we have a couple different hosted shows on our HealthcareNOW Radio that do just that. So they're on YouTube, and then they've got the audio content on HealthcareNOW Radio. You can use a transcript app to transcribe the audio or the video to create an article, and this, of course, has SEO value. You can embed the audio into that article. You can embed the audio and the video. Some people might want to watch the video. You can reverse webinar usage, meaning you could take a webinar, which is obviously usually really thought leadership driven and can be very conversational versus PowerPoint driven, like this one is today. But you could use it to create audio content, right? Either talking about what that webinar was about, and editing the audio content out so it's not like next slide, or anything, there's no slide mention. Or I think even a better idea, if you're hosting a thought leadership webinar, a better idea is to take the players on that webinar, and right after that webinar, spend 30 minutes doing a recording for audio so that it's fresh on the mind. You've taken questions from the audience, and it's this aftermath conversation, because the thought leaders are already there, your guests are there, maybe your customer client is involved. You're already in the same virtual room, so why not take it a next step further and create engaging audio content on the topic that you just talked about, that is not slide driven but conversational. You can edit audio content to create social media teasers on that you can do that for YouTube. You can obviously the most obvious place is for Twitter, for LinkedIn, and be sure to think about a sonic logo. That is not an easy thing to do, but think about like the HBO, Netflix experience, so that you begin to craft a recognizable sonic logo for your company. You can obviously tie audio content to a gated ebook or white paper, which of course helps our favorite thing, which is lead gen. So if you think about it, if you're doing audio content, or you have a thought leader that was interviewed by one of our radio show hosts, or interviewed on a podcast, usually there's a topic that thought leaders talking about that probably relates to some sort of corporate asset that you already have in play or are developing, be it an ebook, a white paper, a case study. You can certainly, in the place on your website where you're putting that audio content, underneath it, do you want to learn more? Download this ebook, and so now you've got this sort of synergy between the thought leadership, what they're talking about on the audio content, and a lead gen component. You can also create an infographic to publish and share, which is something we've recently done, a series of infographics about our various radio hosts. That was kind of fun. And analytics. So this is my Marsha moment, and for good reason. To be honest with you, I've yet to have a conversation in the past 5 years probably about our radio and podcast opportunities without the subject of analytics coming up. And I get it. We're marketers, we're agency types. We live and sort of breathe these analytics to either show ROI or to show our clients and so forth. But unfortunately, because of the nature of internet radio and podcasts, analytics are limited. But there are some things happening. There are some bright spots, and there are also some things that you can do to help, get some analytics on your own. So first of all, as a general rule, this is not, obviously across the board, but as a general rule, internet radio platforms provide listener count, average listening time, and geographic info. Podcast platforms that you host your podcasts on, like Blueberry, Libsyn, SoundCloud, blah blah blah, generally provide plays, downloads, some gender and age. If you go to Apple Podcasts and create a podcaster account, Libsyn, which is really on the high end, they provide a little bit more detailed information from RSS feeds, so they can tell you exactly where the podcast traffic plays come from, and they can even give you social media stats. Amazon Echo and their flash briefings does provide listener stats. Google Podcast Analytics debuted in May 2020, and that will tell you what kind of device your listener came through, whether it was a smart speaker or a smartphone or a tablet. But at the end of the day, I think the best analogy I can draw to radio listeners and podcast listeners is a YouTube viewer. So obviously a lot of companies, a lot of, as marketers and brand experts, we may have videos on YouTube, we put videos on YouTube. And when you do that, you can see how many views you got, but pretty much that's about it. So so podcast and radio is obviously more robust than YouTube, but that is kind of the analogy that we need to sort of take our page from. But there are things you can do in by yourself that will help give you some additional analytics. First of all, obviously, if you have recorded content, and really what I'm talking about, to go on your website that is not an internet streaming site, but a podcast or a recorded interview, you're going to put that on your website, right? I hope you are anyway, which means you can then, at the very least, look for spikes on Google Analytics in the days where the content is published or socially shared or promoted in newsletter, et cetera. So if you're putting this recorded audio content on your website, it obviously becomes a web page and creates a tracking mechanism for Google. Secondly, we're talking about audio content, which is content that falls under digital channels. So if you're creating a show or have a show or thinking about creating a show, make sure that you think about also creating a separate email list and social channels dedicated entirely to that show. So while audio content metrics still have a long ways to go, you can still create your own channels around a show that offer data and engagement rates. You could also consider UTM codes for audio content page links and on social media and email campaigns that you're doing, especially if you do a heavy promotional campaign schedule around perhaps a recorded interview of a thought leader or a podcast show. And finally, of course, if you're putting content on your site that is audio recorded, you want to make sure that you have a form for listeners to contact you, or even for potential guests to contact you if that's the format of your show. But give them a way to reach you. ROI. Okay, so we're getting down to the nitty-gritty here, into the heart of it, and we all know that great content drives results, and again, this is what we've done for years as content marketers. And so here at HealthcareNOW Radio, we're fortunate to have a substantial network of listeners, readers, and followers that we share all the content on our HealthcareNOW Radio with. Right? So we're lucky in that regard. I've already given you our footprint numbers, but in who listens to us, and we obviously spend every single day pushing that radio and podcast content out to all of our followers and listeners and readers. But that said, almost without exception, everyone that we work with, whether they do a radio show with us or a podcast, or they get a thought leader on for an interview, they all uniformly across the board have either one, two, or all three primary goals as to why they're doing it. There are other reasons too, I'm sure, but I'm just talking about the primary goals for this audio content is they want to establish relationships with industry peers, or to be seen in the same light, right? So that like attracts like kind of thing. And they want to increase the national spotlight on thought leadership, and they want to generate more interest in their brand, right? So a fourth goal may be lead generation, but as we already talked about, that can be difficult with audio content because it is naturally an ungated environment. But as I said, you can tie white papers and ebooks and assets to that recorded audio content. But these are the three primary goals. These are the goals that I continually hear over and over again when I have these conversations with marketers and agencies looking to engage our listeners. And I just, we obviously get people on our radio station across the board on all of our radio shows, our 16 radio shows, and all of our 8 podcast only shows, which are predominantly hosted shows with a guest. And these guests run the gamut. I've given you a very brief snapshot of just like the most recent guests in the last month or so, some of the people that we've had either on one of our radio shows or on our podcast shows. So that, when we talk to companies who have thought leaders, or we talk to PR agencies who are trying to promote their thought leaders, they obviously want to know the kind of the kind of people that we have on our radio station, right? Or in our podcast channel, or who are these people that these hosted shows are talking to? And so this is a great snapshot. Again, sort of runs the gamut between, C-level vendors to the nonprofit world to government agencies like the ONC and CMS to the education side of it and so forth. So let's talk about that ROI per se as it relates to audio content on a general level or from a big picture level, I guess is a better way to say that. And first and foremost is that audio content gets information and interesting facts about your company and thought leader and brand out, not only to existing customers, but prospects as well, and potential customers we all know who are familiar with you to begin with, and what you do and your approach when they do contact you have a pretty good level of expectation as to what they can expect if they have a conversation with you after finding your show, after listening to that interview of your thought leader, after listening to a couple episodes of your podcasts. Production and distribution costs involved are comparatively low, far less expensive, obviously, than some other traditional marketing tactics. In-person conferences, of course, when they resume, is a pretty big price tag. And I always argue that if you put your thought leader up in front of a stage at a conference and get a couple hundred people, that's great. But why not put them on the radio for a couple of weeks and get 2,000 listeners, right? You can make yourself emotionally approachable by giving your abstract brand a voice. That is almost difficult to do. Maybe not impossible, difficult to do on a web page of a website. You can position a thought leader in your company as the one that understands your target group by clearly explaining the issues that they face. That is a huge value for this audio content. Because at the same time, there are very few mediums out there that offer you so much space to present your thought leaders and companies and products to an audience, right? If you think about it, our average listener on our radio station listens in for 48 minutes, which is, in today's world is pretty much a lifetime, right? So now you've got this time that you're giving this audience to learn about you that is not 30 seconds on a web page, right? And of course, audio content allows you to convey unique industry knowledge to an audience, a listening audience, and create real value as your thought leader takes on the role of the expert, right? That's at the end of the day, that is a critical piece of the audio content pie. So what does ROI mean to you? So some brands measure ROI in overall awareness and share of voice. Some have a mandate to provide insights, knowledge, help, or guidance on topics or industry challenges. And others simply know that high engagement on various platforms eventually translates to leads and to sales, assuming that it's not done in a one-off environment, that it's a continual practice of being a voice out there and driving a show to reach listeners. But in the end of the day, you all measure content ROI differently depending on your goals. That said, every company, every brand needs to think about the potential to capture new audiences and captivate existing audiences for longer periods of time. That is the critical moment that we're in right now with digital media and versus audio. If you think back to when social media opened up to company pages, Facebook added a company page, you had to develop entirely new strategies to connect with social media audiences on a level that they expected, not what you expected, but what they expected. And as a brand, you had to develop a personality and find a way to create that personality through these social media opportunities. Think back to when companies started blogs. I mean, the goal then was to create content to keep an audience engaged. It's all about engagement, right? And back then it was 3 to 5 minutes. Today, of course, that number is more likely 1 to 2 minutes. And if they're on your blog article for 2 minutes, you're probably doing a happy dance. But the point is, the goal of the blog, the goal of the social media, the company pages, the thought leadership articles, all of that are ways to try to engage and captivate an audience. And with audio content, you can engage and captivate a listener's audience for potentially hours, not seconds like a tweet, not a minute like a web page, but potentially for hours. And you can do it in an environment where distractions are minimum. Once someone starts listening to a show, a radio, or a podcast, they're locked in until you give them a reason not to be, right? As I said, our radio station listener averages really 48 minutes on our site, which is, again, a lifetime in this environment. But of course, the key is good content. And just like other platforms, the impact of good content is long-term and can build awareness and impact the bottom line by attracting new audiences, growing relationships with current audiences, creating a new voice, increasing your share of voice, and possibly even changing perceptions in the marketplace, that's really what the ROI I would like to leave you with on this section, which is changing the perception of the marketplace for an audience that could potentially buy your product, get in touch with you. We're in this landscape today with COVID where everybody's perceptions are changing, right? It seems like every single day. And so if you can create, or we can help you create, or you can work in an environment like audio with a podcast or a radio show, and you're literally talking about, what's happening today, what's coming down the pike, how you, as a potential buyer at a hospital system or a medical practice, or if at a vendor, how you need to be looking at our new world for everybody. To me, that's incredibly powerful. Just a real brief slide on how we work with companies and agencies. We create and host NPR-style radio shows. These shows average approximately 2,600 plus listeners. That's per week, but actually that's per month, my bad. And the podcast replays per episode average anywhere from 300 to 500. We syndicate existing audio content, either on our radio station and or our podcast. We do sponsored interviews of thought leaders, and we do limited podcast series for those companies who want to perhaps dip their toe into the podcast lane. And then we offer NPR-style commercials and educational spots, as well as sponsorship of show episodes. Here's some links if you'd like to explore, including our streaming radio platform and our companion website. Obviously, as I mentioned, we use SoundCloud as our podcast hosting platform, our program page, and then we have a how to listen page, and then of course our Twitter handle. With that, I'm going to leave you for the day. Please connect with me. Send me an email at carol@hightechanswers.com if you've got any questions. I will be sharing this recording and the slide deck with you. And all of you out there, stay safe. And again, I appreciate your time.